Jeez, it's been way too long since I last touched this thing. And today for ADG Pro, we're going back to an old favorite of mine, Seek and Destroy, a game which I probably oversold when I first talked about it, as it has some weird quirks for sure, and the rotational overhead camera isn't going to be comfortable for everyone. But heck, I found that out the hard way, as way back when I covered this game on ADG over a decade ago, I was gearing up with a game idea with similar gameplay, and the pre-alpha to test the controls and everything gave a third of everyone trying it motion sickness. However, there's one thing about this game which has always bugged me, and it has to do with the stats presented. Whether you're flying the chopper or driving the tank, they both have 3 stats you can tweak: fuel, armor, and speed. But these stats aren't presented numerically, simply as little bars you can adjust prior to starting a mission. Well, the goal for today is to figure out just how well balanced these stats are, and to see if there's any other quirks about them we should be aware of for maximizing survival. However, this turned out to be way easier to figure out than I expected, meaning there's surprisingly little to go into. Thus, to that end, I'm going to take this opportunity to reiterate some of the reasons why I make these ADG Pro videos in the first place, since we're just one shy of having 30 of these things, and those reasons may have gotten lost along the way. The main reason I started making the ADG Pro and ADG Mod videos was to have legitimate reasons to go back and play some of my favorite DOS games again. Sure, I could theoretically just do that in my spare time, but that actually requires someone to have spare time to do so. And really, I have very little spare time anymore. And I know it doesn't look it because I still don't have anything to show for it, but I put a ton of effort into game development still. And then between game dev and working on videos, I tend to prefer playing somewhat more modern games, simply by nature of having played those games less over the years, or never before in the case of games which are brand new. True, the vast majority of new stuff doesn't appeal to me, but that doesn't mean nothing does, and I'd be foolish to write off modern games entirely. Heck, it used to be that way with the old stuff back when it was all new. However, one of the other key reasons for making the ADG Pro and ADG Mod videos has to do with the challenge of it. Now, oftentimes when I come out with a particular deep dive into a game in a pro video, one or more people may make comments about how the information was readily available online, or that it could have been hacked out of the exe or data files, and I didn't have to go through all the trouble. But that's not the point. The point is not to find the easy answers, but to instead challenge ourselves to figure out the answers with as little external aid as possible. True, I've bent the rules a couple times just to avoid getting completely deadlocked, but I find this process extremely interesting as it is, in a sense, a puzzle game in and of itself, with a simple goal of finding the answers through a mix of trial and error, logic, and math, while at the same time having to come up with viable methods of testing the possibilities. This all sort of culminates together in being able to play old DOS games differently than intended, which in turn lets us both test and push the boundaries of how these games were built, but also helps make them interesting again. One of the things I've mentioned before, specifically when it comes to using cheats in games, is that, me personally, I don't start using cheats in a game until after I have beaten the game and gotten everything I wanted out of it, because then using cheats lets me explore the game's construction and limits, allowing me to play the game by my terms. But even then, there's actually surprisingly few games where I use cheats at all, because often I can do all of that without those cheats. Nevertheless, it's always fun to walk through walls to see what's beyond the usual boundaries, or get items far earlier than intended to see what happens when the proper sequence of events are broken. The point is that deep diving these old games is fun and interesting, and it breathes new life into them, and it's my hope that those of you watching become more interested in them again as a result of those efforts. These pro videos are a way to extend the fun beyond what can be accomplished through a typical retrospective review, as is how these games are typically presented anymore online, either by myself or others. But now, let's get back to Seek and Destroy here. When I noticed that there wasn't much to go into in regards to the stat balancing, I thought about maybe taking a deeper look into the weapons and damage rates as well, but quite frankly, all of the weapons in the game serve their own purposes. There's nothing superfluous in the whole bunch, so it really does come down to loading up and getting fully equipped with the weapons you're able to utilize best. Though as I've mentioned before, the homing missiles are the best weapons in the game by a long shot. So let's figure out what those 3 adjustable stats are really doing. As despite being represented as a bar, both Fuel and Armour range from 1 to 30 points, and Speed ranges from 2 to 60 points. When you adjust Fuel or Armour, it counters with Speed, and when you adjust speed, both fuel and armor are equalized to appropriate points. Now, the tricky thing here is that you can adjust speed by single point increments, which in turn causes fuel and armor to hit half point increments. And my initial testing showed these bars were somewhat inaccurate, so you can't really use the pixel precise positions shown to gauge exactly how good or bad they've been set to. But they're close enough to more predictable metrics that you don't really have to be concerned about any of that. And the way I tested this all out was pretty simple too. For fuel and speed, I was able to test those at the same time, simply by moving straight and measuring how long it took for scenery to just start appearing versus just start moving off screen, and that the total amount of time I was able to fly for would indicate how much fuel I had. Keeping in mind that in this game, you lose fuel at a fixed rate simply by being in your chopper or tank. Whether you're moving or not makes no difference. Now for armor, I just went up to enemy turrets with skill set to low and counted the shots needed to destroy me, keeping in mind that everything does double damage on medium skill and triple damage on high skill. Once I had all of my numbers figured out, I noticed they were pretty rough, but they did ultimately line up fairly well to more reasonable numbers, which is when I noticed something very interesting. The way this has all been set up, having one of those three stats all the way to the right side in the green will make that stat 7 times as good as if it were all the way to the left in the red. While if the stat is perfectly centered, it's 4 times as good as its minimum value. This means max fuel lasts 7 times as long as minimum fuel, max armor can withstand 7 times as much damage as minimum armor, and max speed lets you move 7 times faster than minimum speed. These results are kind of curious though for a number of reasons. The first thing to consider is that because the change is so dramatic between minimum and maximum, there are diminishing returns to having specific stats boosted too much. Just a few pixels over minimum will effectively double how good a stat is, but then you have to go up to the middle to get it doubled again, and if you want it doubled a third time, it's not possible, as even going all the way up to max green only gets you 3/4 of the way there. Essentially, the further into the red a stat goes, the significantly worse it gets. But the higher up into the green a stat goes, the less of a relative boost it really gets. Another consideration is dodging. The armor stat specifically is for protecting you from damage, but if you never get hit, then you really don't need that much armor. Thus, regardless of anything, armor is a stat you want more of if you're not good at dodging attacks, and less of if you want to rely more on your own skill at maneuvering around. A third consideration is range. The range of your chopper or tank is effectively a mix of how long it can go for on a full tank of gas and at what speed. This means the fuel and speed stats might have a sweet spot in terms of their own balancing, whereby if you made one lower or higher than that spot, you would end up with effectively less range. Well, I tested this out and found out there technically is a sweet spot, but in order for it to even be in play really, you need to have more than a middle amount of armor. If you drop your armor down to boost your speed and or fuel, the sweet spot for the range ends up moving beyond stats you're allowed to set, and thus having more fuel, not speed, will result in better range no matter what. However, as you raise armor above the middle point, that sweet spot starts to drop down from maximum fuel, and by the time you reach maximum armor, the sweet spot for fuel versus speed to get the best range possible ends up being just on the right side of the yellow middle bar for fuel. Any less fuel for more speed, or any more fuel for less speed, and you begin to lose range. Again though, this is only a consideration when you have very high amounts of armor, which in turn limits the balance between your speed and fuel. And if you don't max out your armor, just raise it higher than middle, then this sweet spot for range also won't move all the way to where I indicated, and I'll be higher up the fuel bar. The final thing I tested out was comparing these stats between the chopper and the tank. Now, I always knew the tank had twice as much armor than the chopper for the same armor stats, but what about fuel and speed? How do those factor in? Well, fuel was simple enough because it turns out your fuel stat is identical between the chopper and tank. However long your fuel lasts in the chopper, that same fuel stat will last just as long in the tank. You can last about 45 seconds without a refuel if your fuel stat is set as low as it can go, and can instead last a little over 5 minutes with a maximized fuel stat. For speed, when I did the measurements, I found that the chopper was exactly 60% faster than the tank for all matching speed settings, and yikes does this make a huge difference in how the game feels. In the tank, minimum speed takes about 13 1/3 seconds to cross one full screen height of distance, whereas this only takes a couple seconds at maximum speed. Well, in the chopper, minimum speed crosses a full height of the screen in about 8 1/3 seconds, while maximum speed zips across that same distance in just over a second. So yeah, even though this testing was super simple, it did reveal some useful things about how the stats are balanced in this game. But firstly, each stat ranges from 100% to 700% of its base value, which in turn makes it so that each point of change is far more meaningful in the red zone than in the green zone. Armor is less useful the better you are at dodging. Fuel is almost always better than speed in terms of flight range, except if you have higher than middle armor, the sweet spot for range drifts away from maximum fuel towards the 2/3 fuel mark, and that while you get less range with greater speed over fuel, greater speed aids in dodging shots and thus can be more useful in that regards. But I think the most pertinent thing learned from all of this is that if you have no idea how best to tweak these stats, just leave them all right in the middle at 400%, since any adjustment you do from this default position will cause your overall balance to be worse, since each point less in a stat makes a bigger difference in performance than each point more. And by the way, one final thing I found out about this game, I don't actually own the manual for it, so when I was online earlier looking to see if I could find a digitized copy to see if there's any pertinent information in it, I discovered that the devs really wanted players to be able to play this game however they wanted. As I mentioned before, how you can change the skill setting at any time you want, even in the middle of a mission, but I also learned that the manual just blatantly lists out all of the game's cheat codes right in there. Yeah, definitely not a common sight with games to have the cheats listed right there in the freaking manual. Anywho, that'll be all for today's ADG Pro video. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now, on May 11th, will be a standard review, episode 327, where we're going to be taking a look at a game that's, probably worse than Depth Dwellers. Yeah, make sure you stay tuned because, quite frankly, I'm a little scared of what I'm about to get myself into. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to join the ranks of everyone you see here supporting the show directly, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.